Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video and myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War news update. First part thereof for the 3rd of August 2024. This is the Ukrainian General Staff figures for the Russian losses for the day before, where we usually start. Take account of all of the caveats that apply. They can be found in the description to the video below. 1,170 personnel lost is a high number, of course, as they are every day. In that category, 4 tanks, 27 armoured personnel vehicles. So 4 tanks is again another low day there, but 27 APVs is fairly high. That's well over the daily average. 56 artillery systems is typically high. The number of artillery systems they lose on a daily basis is phenomenal. 1 multiple launch rocket system, 1 anti-aircraft warfare system, 54 vehicles and fuel tanks, and 4 pieces of special equipment. So some fairly challenging numbers for the Russians. Nothing too out of the ordinary. Looks like they used a number of armoured personnel vehicles yesterday, and some fairly high personnel losses mean that they probably were attacking as much as they can at the moment, the Russians. Andrew Perpetua's lost stats are typically huge for the Russians. It was a bad day for ATVs and motorcycles, also Bradleys and Starlinks. Okay, let's have a look at the losses. And if you take off all of the Starlink, because he includes comms equipment that some people are particularly interested in, it can sometimes skew the data, particularly in terms of the Ukrainian losses, because we're looking at, say, combat asset losses like tanks and AFVs and whatnot. Starlinks are relatively cheap, $1,000 a pop, and that's not as interesting for me or for our purposes, but there are other people that find that incredibly important. So if you took all of those off there, then the losses would be far lower for the Ukrainians. So that, for our purposes at least, skews the data a little bit. And if you look at the combat losses, you've probably got just over 10 there. And the Russians have actually not a huge number today, but mainly artillery. So maybe a 1.5 to 1 combat losses, Russian to Ukrainian. So that's not as good as Ukraine would want, but then it could be because they are running too low of some of those vehicles, so that you are seeing ATVs featuring incredibly heavily. So your golf buggies and your quads. You've got civilian vehicles featuring heavily compared to the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have 3 civilian vehicles and no trucks and no ATVs. The Russians have all of these vehicles in that category, and I think that's because they are using some of these vehicles instead of combat assets, which tells its own story. Okay, so for Ukrainian losses, if we take off the Starlinks, okay, there's an electronic warfare Book of L system, Plaston RP3000, surveillance and comms equipment, slightly more valuable than probably these others, especially the Starlinks. Although losing that many Starlinks is obviously going to hurt. Engineering vehicle and excavator lost there, some howitzers, 3 Bradleys abandoned. That is not good news. 1 hit by a Lancet, 1 disabled by an anti-tank guided missile, and the other taken out by an FPV drone. That's going to hurt the Ukrainians. I hope that they should get a whole bunch of Bradleys soon, surely. I mean, we haven't had Bradleys on an aid package for a long time, and they are certainly going through them at the moment. So that's the Ukrainian losses. A few other bits and pieces, nothing too major. And then for the Russians, we have a destroyed Grad, BM-21 Grad multiple launch rocket system, a whole range of artillery pieces damaged. Then we go on to a few tanks, a few infantry fighting vehicles, and a few APCs, and huge numbers of trucks, ATVs, and civilian vehicles, motorcycles, quads, golf buggies. Just an awful lot of kit that the Russians are losing. A lot of that in the last 2 categories, destroyed as opposed to damaged, with the trucks more damaged than destroyed. But just an awful lot of equipment that the Russians are cycling through, and that is pretty unsustainable. Although in combat losses, it's mainly artillery kit that they've lost as a recovery vehicle thrown in for good measure too. Okay, moving on. Ukrainian Marines have destroyed, says War Monitor, a large assault grouping of Russian paratroopers near Vovchansk in a large battle on paratrooper. day in a large battle on Paratrooper Day for the Russian army. So this is national. Both sides seem to have these national days for each element of their armed forces, and it's National Paratrooper Day for the Russian army, and they've lost a whole load of them supposedly around Vovchansk. And then there isn't too much else. There is footage I could show you, but nothing that tells you anything new. Just to say that Mali rebels or Malian rebels have come out with a figure on the number of Wagner mercenaries who were killed, and that's 84 in that ambush. Wagner rebels that were involved in security in Mali, and there are supposedly sort of 15 or so who have been captured. Some Telegram channels are offering sort of $25,000 for their release, but there's thoughts are abounding at the moment that some of those POWs might end up in Ukrainian hands, or at least that was one of the offers. Don't know if that will actually happen. But Ukrainian special forces, I believe, have been in this area working with the rebels to strike against these Wagner mercenaries. And of course, the loss of such a significant number of mercenaries will help Ukraine back in Ukraine. As I've mentioned before, Russia are making money in these places, and that money is able to be siphoned back to Russia to put into the war effort. They're also using resources in these other places, so Sudan, Mali, Syria, and we've seen strikes in all three of those places on Wagner equipment and Russian equipment. And that means that they either have to get more equipment from Russia, or they have to pull back from those areas or be less effective in those areas. And that affects Russia's strategic capabilities worldwide, their influence operations and their money making operations in these other countries, or they have to pull equipment from Russia, as mentioned, to keep doing what they're doing in those places, and then that gives a greater chance of that equipment not being used in Ukraine. So there is definitely good rationale for the Ukrainians helping out in or fighting directly against these Wagner mercenaries and Russian entities outside of Ukraine. And there's a website called All Eyes on Wagner, alleyesonwagner.org, and they've got a massive article on this engagement in Mali, giving you some background information and exactly what happened and what capabilities Wagner and the Russians have out in Mali. It's worth having a little look at. So go and check All Eyes on Wagner and this one's out today, their 3rd of August piece. This is there's a French version of this as well. I think it is actually a French website that this one here is translated into English. So there you go. Anyway, we'll move on to strikes because it's been a huge day for strikes. Okay, first thing is that the Russians struck Ukraine with 29 Shahed drones, 24 were shot down. There were also 4 missiles, none of them were shot down. So 2 S-300s, surface-to-air missile systems used in ground attack mode, and 2 Kh-31P anti-radar missiles shot from over the Black Sea. Don't know what the damage has been to Ukrainian infrastructure or whatnot. Sloviansk may have been the site of one of the missile attacks. There was a single strike leaving a big crater in the city in the free part of Donetsk. Little damage reported, no casualties, so that could be an S-300 more likely. Sloviansk is behind Chasiv Yar, one of those semicircle of cities and towns. You've got Kramatorsk, Druzhkivka, Sloviansk. Vinnytsia was also hit overnight. A large explosion, which local officials this morning admitted was an infrastructure object hit by Russia's attack drones. So something could have been hit there that was intended to be hit, so it could be a useful target for the Russians, don't know. Also problems in Mykolaiv, but the governor says it was due to falling debris. Falling wreckage from 2 Shahed caused a blaze in some buildings there. And yeah, okay, some more. Yeah, I think I've got this one coming later. Right, we'll go on to a bit more detail here. Why does it always reconfigure what it thinks I want to talk about? It's so annoying. Okay, on to the next topic, which is the huge attack that took place in Russian territory and occupied territories of Ukraine, but mainly Russian territory actually, with attack drones. So oil depot in Rostov in Russia is still smoking in the morning. Local media report that's actually there are three separate burning things in that video. So Russian Ministry of Defense reports shooting down 75 drones overnight. This is exactly what I prefer to see, which is a large number of drones used on fewer targets rather than lots of drones used on lots of targets. 36 in Rostov, and we'll talk about that because the main target was an airbase, and I think they've given it a right good tonking. 8 in the Kursk region, 9 in Belgorod, 17 in Oryol region, 2 in Ryazan, 1 each over Voronezh and the Sea of Azov and Krasnodar region. So the Russians claiming they shot down lots and lots of drones. The reality is that there's a big burning oil depot there, so they definitely didn't shoot down the drones there. And there's an airport that has been airbase that has been absolutely hammered. Okay. Russian Telegram channels write that their air defense was operating over Kursk, and there was an attack by a huge number of drones. Ukrainian channels also write that Ukraine is now attacking with missiles on Russian positions on the left bank of Kherson. So that's another little nugget to add into that. Okay, so lots of evidence of Kursk being targeted with CCTV cameras showing explosions and whatnot last night. General Staff saying a number of oil depots and fuel and lubricant storage facilities were also attacked in Belgorod, Kursk and Rostov regions. So multiple oil depots and hydrocarbon infrastructure entities taken out yesterday. Here is still burning in the Morozovsky district. An emergency situation has been declared. Following a nighttime drone attack, residents are advised to close their windows and stay indoors. So, as I say, multiple oil depots here. The Atlas oil depot in the Kamensky district has been built only a few years ago, so it's brand new. Today, the NASA firm's map shows them burning. That is not good news for the Russians. And then we get on to the major haul for the Ukrainians, major success. Last night, there were significant strikes in Russia, including attacks on an oil depot in Morozovsk airfield in the Rostov region. So when we saw the number hitting Rostov, 36 drones on Rostov, a lot of them were aimed at Morozovsk airfield. Exploding ammunition was heard, so lots of secondary explosions. There are huge amounts of videos of all of these drone strikes, including on Morozovsk airfield. Reports also indicate that several drones hit buildings at Oryol. The Russian Ministry of Defense claimed to have shot down 75 drones, as mentioned. Right, so Morozovsk airfield, where in Rostov Oblast, where ammunition depots were hit at the airbase. They were supposedly storing glide bombs among other weapons. That's according to General Staff. So this could be a useful destruction of ammunition. But I think also there are many rumors of perhaps many bombers being destroyed here. Don't know. Take it with a pinch of salt. There are definitely huge explosions taking place that are caught on camera, and some really significant cook-offs. Now, what is important about this FIRMS data? So remember, the FIRMS data is your NASA data that catches fires. Essentially, it was designed to catch wildfires around the world. It's now been used to see how successful strikes are against different sides in this war. Now, this is supposedly one of the most widespread FIRMS data hauls in a single place. And what I would imagine is that each of these squares, and the larger squares there even more so, are strikes. So I think you have seen finally an airbase hit with enough significant ordnance that you are going to do huge amounts of damage to this. This is the third time Morozovsk has been hit. It's been targeted by the Ukrainians. It's about 300 kilometers behind front lines, but this is a really significant bunch of damage done to that base. Ukrainian forces overnight targeted the Morozovsk airbase, home to the 559th Aviation Regiment and the Russian Air Force. It's rumored many medium-range bombers have been destroyed. Lots of videos of cooking off equipment blowing up there. So this is the one we're going to have to watch out for going forward in the next sort of 24 hours or so, because hopefully there'll be some satellite imagery coming out of this airbase that will indicate what exactly has been damaged and whether any airframes have been taken out, and that will be super useful because it's from places like this that you get bombers taking off to drop those guided glide bombs. Okay, Tim White says, I've been tipped off that Ukraine thinks it's managed to hit a GRU unit in Rostov during a night attack. Russia's military unit 11659 and their 22nd Separate Special Forces Brigade were a target awaiting confirmation. So he says, just talking about these hits, as well as the attack on the oil plant in Rostov, the drones from Ukraine also reached oil storage depots in both Kursk and Belgorod. Hits are so far unconfirmed, but evidence from social media reports that Gubkinsky oil plant 100 kilometers northeast of Belgorod was struck. In Oriol, one person was injured as a drone hit a residential building in the night. So that was quite early that happened. We saw evidence of that. I saw evidence of that before I went to sleep last night, causing understandable panic. It's almost certainly drone debris. Russia says 17 drones were shot down in that region. Yes, so I think that's all for the Ukrainian attacks on Russia. Just keep your eyes peeled today. There will be more information, no doubt, coming through. And that's exactly what you want to see because, of course, Ukraine are on a back foot in terms of what's going on the front lines. Russia throwing everything and the kitchen sink at the front line. They are exhausting themselves, but with the hope of exhausting Ukraine critically and finding those holes in the front line that they can exploit. It's just a case of both sides being absolutely sort of wasted in this. Although Ukraine have mobilized quite a lot of troops, I think. There are different rumours about that, but they just need them to be properly trained first. They don't want to throw them in untrained because they'll get in trouble. It'll be a real bad political loss, but also you don't want to do that to your resources, to your humans, to your citizens. And B, they're waiting for them to get equipped with enough decent equipment, and that is a reliance on really Western aid packages coming through. So Jakub Janowski here says, I completely agree with this whole thread. I almost read this one yesterday, I think, because it came out just before I did my piece yesterday, but I didn't in the end. So anyway, this is just an opinion about what's going on the front lines from Yoni Escola. The elephant in the room: Ukraine's delayed and insufficient mobilization is a primary cause of Ukraine's current challenges at the front. Allies have offered insufficient military aid, arriving too late and burdened with excessive restrictions. These are indisputable facts, yet Ukraine's manpower shortage and its frontline situation would be better if it had mobilized earlier and more extensively. I mean, this is one of the big criticisms that is maintained. It's been really consistent. Lots of people saying they just didn't mobilize soon enough. They were waiting for the Verkhovna Rada. Things just didn't happen quickly enough there. There wasn't enough pressure, I think, from the top down. The enactment of Ukraine's mobilization law was significantly delayed, says Escola, and the mobilization of men has been insufficient. Despite there being valid and compelling reasons for this, when confronted with an existential threat and genocide, no justification is sufficient to abstain from taking every possible action to enhance the chances of survival. Ukraine could have strengthened the position on the front lines earlier, reducing territorial losses by mobilizing more troops, an undeniable reality. Additionally, there are infantry shortages in many units, and Ukraine lacks units at the front and in reserve. In certain areas, the situation on the front is somewhat critical, but overall it is far from dire. Russia's invasion of Ukraine can be described as a dismal failure at best. Had anyone informed us in March 2022 that Russia would still be battling for Chasiv Yar in August 2024, we would have undoubtedly viewed it as a significant victory for Ukraine. It's a really good point there, by the way, and it's not trying to paint this all in terms of, hopium positivity, hopium and copium. The reality is that Russia were very close to taking hold of Ukraine, and that, or at least taking Kyiv, and that would have been. If it wasn't for Hostomel Airport going south, going wrong for them, and a few other bits and pieces, and Zelensky deciding to stay, and the Ukrainians putting up fierce resistance, and the Russians getting bogged down logistically, then things could have been very different. But now, 2.5 years later, Russia are fighting way back over there near Chasiv Yar. Kyiv is relatively safe. They're not in the north at all, apart from a couple of little places in Kharkiv, which has been a dismal failure. And then that whole eastern front they've taken land and they are continually grinding away at the Ukrainian front lines. But my goodness, if you had said in on February the 25th or something, a couple of days after the Russians had invaded, that in 2.5 years' time, the fighting would be all the way over there in Chasiv Yar, and they're still failing to take that, struggling to get across a canal there. You'd be like, yeah, we'll take that. We'll take that. That's a massive success for Ukraine. So I think it's easy to get bogged down in a loss of square kilometers here and there. And that is bad. And Ukraine are losing ground, and it's going to be very difficult to take that ground back militarily, more likely to be taken back politically or through a collapse of the Russians. Politically first, and anyway, it's easy to get all doomy and gloomy looking at maps every day, but the reality is Russia have completely, I think, failed in their expansionist conquest. Despite suffering over 500,000 casualties, says Ascola, and receiving material aid from its allies, Russia has yet to successfully invade any of the 23 regional capital or special status cities controlled by Ukraine at the onset of the invasion. Ukraine's situation will remain challenging for the coming months, but is expected to improve by the end of the year as mobilisation begins to yield results. Additionally, the shell situation and fortifications, we will see enhancements during this time. The undeniable reality is that Ukraine's allies have failed to provide sufficient support, and Ukraine will also need to mobilise more men in the future. While deeply unfair, there seems to be no alternative to this situation. Ukraine's optimal approach to prevailing in this unjust war involves prioritising defence, exercising extreme patience, and refraining from larger offensives. The attrition favours Ukraine and is evidence that Russia will not be able to sustain this indefinitely. This is something I said a number of times, lots of people have said, which is you don't want to go on the offensive and grind your own resources down. Offensives just cost an awful lot, but especially when the enemy is so well dug in. The lightning counteroffensive of Kharkiv happened because the Russians weren't dug in. They weren't sufficiently defending those areas, and the Ukrainians were able to take advantage of that. But since then, fortifications and trenches have been built the length and breadth of the front line, right? So I don't think you're going to manage to do those kind of offensives anymore unless there is just a complete capitulation of one side or the other. And that is looking unlikely. The question is it more likely the Russians will capitulate than the Ukrainians? I don't know. But I think that kind of all-out attack will not bring the kind of results you'd want. So it's going to be this active defense to trip the Russians as they attack, cede territory to them where it's useful to do so, because you're not going to be losing troops, you'll be losing kilometers, as long as you're bleeding the Russians. After suffering significant losses in both personnel and resources, Russia will eventually be compelled to downsize its operation. Although this process may take years, reclaiming territory through battles or negotiations will be much more attainable afterward. So that's his opinion. Make of that what you will. Right, Kyiv Independent says 48% of Ukrainians view Zelensky's party, Servant of the People, political party, negatively, survey says. So it's becoming politically challenging back in Ukraine. Some 48% of Ukrainians hold negative attitude towards President Zelensky's Servant of the People party, while only 13% view it positively, according to a survey of the National Democratic Institute, Kyiv International Institute for Sociology, published on August 1st. A recently registered party of volunteer politician and media personality Serhiy Prytula has the highest rating of positive attitudes among Ukrainians of 28%. Around the same number see it negatively. So I don't think any party is particularly seen as hugely positive here, but the challenge for the ruling party when you've had 2.5 years of war, and even given the success I've just talked to you about and the context of where they're at now compared to where they could have been, people are just going to be naturally feeling fed up with the war and taking that out on the ruling party. The Crimean Bridge could be destroyed in coming months, says Budanov, although he said stuff like this before. The bridge was heavily damaged by Ukrainian strikes on October 2022 and July 2023, prompting Russia to take steps to further defend the structure. There's been rumours that they could be looking at doing this. There's been talk about Romania, I'll have this later, Romania and Ukraine working to give the Neptune missile further range, so that it becomes a weapon of choice for the Ukrainians, because it's an indigenously made weapon, and Romania could be helping out in that. So interesting. Okay, so we have here reason number 235,235 says German aid to Ukraine, that the West needs to support Ukraine much more. Russia wants to wipe out an entire nation and its culture. Have we forgotten what happened in Bucha and Kramatorsk and Izium and in so many other cities in Ukraine? It makes me furious that here in the West, we often think about our money, what another 2 billion in military aid means for our economy, while people in Ukraine regularly lose friends and family, and the father of a small child has been hanging in the trenches for months, trying his best to fight off the devil in person. So this is an emotive response from Germany to Ukraine, but actually it's in the context of there being another claim of Russians beheading Ukrainians, and that's I think what has the pictures there below. I'm sure show some inappropriate stuff there, but there are more claims of Russians doing terrible things to Ukrainians, and it's just like we've seen this now how many times, and yet still people around the world who are supporting Russia. It's just insane. Okay. This week alone, Russia has used more than 600 guided aerial bombs against Ukraine, says Zelensky. That's why it's important that Morozovsk airfield has been hit. Zelensky emphasised the need for decisive action against Russian airstrikes, stating that Russian combat aviation must be destroyed wherever it is, using any effective means. Quote, it's also quite fair to strike Russian airfields. We need this joint decision with our partners, a security decision. This is the only way to ensure protection of our people, he said. Zelensky highlighted the urgency of the situation, noting the significant number of bombs used by Russia in just 1 week. We must stop this daily Russian terror with strong joint decisions. And actually, when you go back to how the Russians are able to take this land off the Ukrainians in these grinding assaults, the foundation of their success, it's the role that aviation plays, and these guided glide bombs that are just hammering the Ukrainian positions relentlessly. 600 of those bombs used in 1 month is far and above what the Ukrainians themselves can use with their own aviation. So it's definitely a massive challenge, and it's really frustrating that allies are sitting back saying, yeah, we know what your issue is, we're just not allowing you to do anything about it with our weapons. And that must just be so irritating. The final thing I'll say, I received a book in the post today. This is a book by Dan Barker, the great Dan Barker, Contradiction. He's signed it for me, which is really cool. I like that, and I'm in the acknowledgements. So we talked about it as he was writing this. It's been endorsed by Stephen Pinker, AC Grayling, Phil Zuckerman, all these great people. Just really, really good stuff. So I'm looking forward. That's going to be a late summer read. Dan Barker wrote the foreword to one of my books, 30 Arguments. If you're interested in philosophy of religion, this is a fab book. I love it. It's a nice, easy read. Just 30 arguments to do with whether or not God exists. You probably know my conclusion there. And Dan Barker wrote the foreword to that, and it's a great little foreword in there. So thanks, Dan, for sending me that. Really appreciate it. Anyway, thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate your support. Take care, and I'll speak soon.